The shriek that erupted from Margaret Wellington's mouth could have shattered the crystal flutes she prized so dearly. She stood at the edge of the Donovan family's backyard, her beige pantsuit practically vibrating with rage as she watched the shimmering blue pool transform before her eyes into what could only be described as an enormous, wobbling mass of electric blue gelatin. "What in God's name have you done?" she screeched, her pearl necklace bouncing against her throat as she jabbed a manicured finger toward the jiggling monstrosity that had, until yesterday, been the crown jewel of Whispering Pines Estates. Rob Donovan, leaning casually against his patio door with a smirk that could only be described as deeply satisfied, sipped his lemonade. "Good morning, Margaret. Is there a problem with my pool? I'm afraid I don't see how that's any of your business, considering it's on my property." Margaret's face contorted through at least 7 distinct expressions of horror before settling on pure, unbridled fury. "My daughter's wedding reception is tomorrow. We sent out invitations weeks ago. The HOA board approved it." "Ah, yes," Rob nodded thoughtfully. "The approval you somehow managed to get without my consent as the actual property owner. Fascinating how that worked out." For Margaret Wellington, known throughout the subdivision as HOA Karen, this was supposed to be her crowning achievement. After 15 years, as president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, she had finally found a way to leverage the one thing her own property lacked: a magazine-worthy backyard pool perfect for her daughter Tiffany's wedding reception. The fact that it belonged to the Donovans, the only family who consistently challenged her authority, made the victory all the sweeter. Or it would have, if that victory hadn't just turned into 20,000 gallons of blue raspberry Jello. "This is sabotage," Margaret hissed, already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting." Rob shrugged. "By all means, but last I checked, the HOA has no jurisdiction over the chemical composition of private swimming pools. I've actually confirmed this with our lawyer." The blood drained from Margaret's face. You did this on purpose." "Did what?" "Create a fun summer surprise for my kids? How was I supposed to know you'd unilaterally claimed my backyard for an event I never agreed to host?" As Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a designer-clad goldfish, neighbors began to gather along the fence line, drawn by her commotion. Smartphones appeared, recording the confrontation. Margaret suddenly became acutely aware that she was creating exactly the kind of neighborhood disturbance she had cited countless homeowners for over the years. "This isn't over," she whispered, smoothing her pantsuit. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But as she stalked away with as much dignity as she could muster, Margaret Wellington felt something unfamiliar curling in her stomach. Beyond the rage and embarrassment lay something more disturbing: the dawning realization that for the first time since moving to Whispering Pines, she might have met her match. Her daughter's perfect wedding was now in jeopardy, her authority publicly challenged, and her carefully cultivated image as the neighborhood's benevolent dictator was wobbling just as precariously as that enormous blue monstrosity behind her. Worse yet, she had exactly 24 hours to fix this catastrophe, or face the one thing Margaret Wellington had successfully avoided her entire adult life: admitting she was wrong. By noon, Margaret's living room had transformed into a war room. 3 HOA board members huddled around her immaculate coffee table while she paced the beige carpet, leaving small indentations with each forceful step. "The bylaws are clear," Martin Green, the HOA treasurer, explained gently. "We can compel homeowners to maintain their properties according to neighborhood standards, but..." "But what?" Margaret snapped. "Are you saying turning a swimming pool into a giant desert meets our standards?" Patricia Winters, vice president of the board, nervously adjusted her glasses. "Technically, there's no specific rule against it. The pool itself is properly maintained, just filled with something unusual." Margaret stopped pacing and fixed Patricia with the stare that had made grown men tremble during violation hearings. "Whose side are you on?" "The bylaws, Margaret," Patricia replied, finding unexpected courage. "And the minutes from last month's meeting show you told us Rob Donovan had enthusiastically agreed to host the reception. If that wasn't true..." The silence that followed was damning. He was going to agree, Margaret said dismissively. Everyone always agrees eventually. That's how this neighborhood works. The third board member, Walter Simmons, cleared his throat. The thing is, Margaret, the Donovans have filed 17 counterclaims against your citations in the past year alone. They've won 14 of them. Margaret's perfectly highlighted hair seemed to bristle. Because you people keep wavering instead of presenting a united front. This neighborhood was a model community before the Donovans moved in with their nonconformist ideas about property rights. Walter held up his phone, showing Margaret the neighborhood's private Facebook group. The blue Jello pool had gone viral within their community, with most comments supporting the Donovans. Worse, someone had dug up and posted the section of bylaws confirming homeowners must approve any events held on their property. Tiffany will be heartbroken, Margaret whispered, momentarily showing genuine vulnerability. Everything was perfect. Patricia's expression softened. Have you considered simply apologizing to Rob, explaining the situation? Margaret's vulnerability vanished instantly. Apologize and admit he's won? Absolutely not. Then what's your plan? Martin asked. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she moved to the window, staring in the direction of the Donovan property. Plan B. If we can't have the reception at the Donovan pool, no one gets to enjoy that monstrosity. Within the hour, Margaret was knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, clipboard in hand. By 3 o'clock, she'd had collected 38 signatures on an emergency health and safety petition, citing concerns about the unknown chemical composition of the Donovan's pool and its potential to attract insects, wildlife, and undesirable elements to their exclusive community. At 4 o'clock, County Health Inspector Bernard Williams arrived at the Donovan residence, looking deeply uncomfortable as Margaret stood triumphantly beside him. I'm sorry about this, he murmured to Rob as he pulled out his testing kit. Someone called in some unusual concerns. Rob smiled easily. No problem at all. While you're testing, would you like some lemonade? Or perhaps some Jello? By 5 o'clock, Inspector Williams was leaving with a keen report, a container of blue Jello, and a statement that food-grade gelatin posed no health risks when properly prepared. Margaret watched from her car as the inspector drove away, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. When her phone rang with Tiffany's custom ringtone, she let it go to voicemail. She couldn't face her daughter's questions yet, not until she found a way to salvage everything. As twilight fell, Margaret sat alone in her car, watching neighborhood children excitedly gathering at the Donovan fence to marvel at the blue wonder. Something dark and desperate was taking root inside her. If the rules wouldn't help her, perhaps it was time to break them. The Donovan kitchen, with its brushed steel appliances and granite countertops that Margaret had once deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines, now felt like neutral territory in an unexpected peace summit. Rob placed a mug of coffee in front of her, real coffee, not the decaf she usually insisted on after 9 p.m., and took a seat across the table. Let's establish what each of us wants, he said, sounding remarkably like the corporate mediator he was in his professional life. You want your daughter to have her wedding reception here tomorrow. I want autonomy over my own property and an end to the constant citations for imaginary violations. Margaret winced at imaginary, but didn't argue. The violations are based on clearly defined standards that seem to be selectively enforced. Rob countered, sliding a folder across the table. I've documented 37 instances where violations identical to ones I've been cited for went unaddressed at properties belonging to your friends. Margaret's cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected him to be so methodical in his opposition. What exactly are you proposing? A new approach to the HOA, Rob said. Collaborative rather than punitive. Majority votes on new regulations instead of executive decisions. And he tapped the folder. A formal apology to the homeowners who've been unfairly targeted. Margaret felt her pride warring with her desperation. And in exchange, I'll help you salvage the reception. The Jello can be dissolved by tomorrow afternoon with the right approach. My wife Nancy is actually friendly with the pool maintenance company owner. We can get an emergency service. Why would you help me after everything? Margaret asked suspiciously. Rob leaned back. Because contrary to what you might think, I'm not interested in neighborhood feuds. I just want to live in peace in the house I pay for. And the video of me breaking in? Deleted once we have an agreement, in writing. As dawn broke over Whispering Pines, Margaret Wellington did something unthinkable. She signed a document limiting her own power. The HOA reform agreement stipulated monthly open forums, transparent voting procedures, and a review of all past violations with possible reimbursements for unjustified fines. In return, Rob made calls to emergency pool services and promised to have his backyard ready by 4 p.m. By noon, massive pool heaters were accelerating the dissolution of the gelatin while a landscaping crew Rob had somehow procured worked miracles on the surrounding yard. Margaret coordinated with the caterers from her own home, afraid to watch the process too closely. At 2 p.m., Patricia Winters appeared at Margaret's door. The board members are all talking. Is it true you're reforming the HOA? Temporarily, Margaret said stiffly, to address the current crisis. Patricia studied her longtime friend. You know, this might not be the disaster you think it is. Some of us have been wanting changes for years. Changes to what? Margaret asked sharply. Our property values are the highest in the county. At what cost, though? No one talks to their neighbors anymore. Everyone's afraid of citations. Remember when we used to have block parties without 20-page approval forms? The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's phone. It was Rob. Pool's ready. You might want to come see before the decorators arrive. When Margaret arrived at the Donovans, she stopped short at the gate. The pool, now restored to its natural state, gleamed turquoise in the afternoon sun. But it wasn't just clean, floating candles had been arranged in the shape of a heart and subtle underwater lights installed. The patio had been transformed with white drapes and delicate flower arrangements that perfectly matched Tiffany's wedding colors. Nancy used to work in event planning, Rob explained, appearing beside her. She had some ideas. It's perfect, Margaret admitted, her voice small. There's one catch, Rob said. We'd like to be invited to the reception, as guests, not servants. Margaret turned to him, seeing Rob Donovan clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as an adversary, but as a neighbor with his own life, own family, own desires for the community. I think that could be arranged, she said carefully. As Rob smiled and extended his hand, Margaret felt something unexpected, relief. Not just about the wedding, but about letting go of a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The exhausting weight of trying to control everything and everyone around her. Is it? She asked, genuine uncertainty in her voice. Most of us think so, he replied. Order is overrated. A little chaos makes room for creativity. Margaret studied the man who had so thoroughly disrupted her world. The Jello was unnecessary, you know. You could have just said no. Rob laughed. Would you have listened? Margaret's silence was answer enough. For what it's worth, Rob continued, I think you have qualities this neighborhood needs. Organization, dedication, vision, just maybe with a little more flexibility. As the last guests departed, Tiffany found her mother still by the poolside. Best wedding ever, she declared, hugging Margaret tightly. Thank you for making it happen, even with the complications. After her daughter left, Margaret remained, contemplating the water. On impulse, she slipped off her designer heels and dipped her feet into the pool, something she hadn't done in years, always too concerned about maintaining her image of perfection. The water felt wonderful. 3 days later, the first meeting of the reformed Whispering Pines HOA convened in the community center. Attendance was higher than it had been in years, with homeowners curious about the rumored changes. Margaret, still president by the terms of the agreement, called the meeting to order. Before we begin, she announced, her voice steady despite her internal uncertainty, I want to introduce a new tradition. Each meeting will start with homeowners sharing improvement ideas rather than violation reports. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Furthermore, Margaret continued, I've appointed Rob Donovan as our new Community Relations Director to help ensure all voices are heard in HOA decisions. As Rob nodded acknowledgement from the back row, Margaret felt something unexpected: lightness. The rigid control she'd maintained for 15 years had been more burden than power. Now, she said, a hint of her old authority returning, but tempered with something new, perhaps wisdom. Who would like to share their vision for making Whispering Pines not just the most valuable neighborhood in the county, but the most vibrant? As hands rose throughout the room, Margaret realized that while her daughter's wedding was over, something else was just beginning. She caught Rob's eye across the room, and he raised an imaginary glass in her direction. To new beginnings, indeed. But as the meeting progressed and Margaret scribbled notes about community gardens and block parties and relaxed color palette options, a small familiar part of her brain was already calculating how long she'd need to wait before subtly steering the HOA back under her influence, just enough to maintain standards without appearing dictatorial. Old habits, after all, die hard. And Margaret Wellington still believed deep down that Whispering Pines needed her particular brand of guidance. The game had changed, but perhaps the player hadn't. Not completely. Not yet. "Mother, you've been surprisingly calm all evening," Tiffany whispered, her white gown catching the last rays of sunset as they reflected off the pool. "I half expected you to micromanage every detail." Margaret smiled tightly, watching guests mingle on the Donovans' immaculate lawn. "Let's just say I've had a perspective adjustment." The reception was, by any standard, a stunning success. Floating candles illuminated the pool where just 24 hours earlier, blue Jello had jiggled mockingly. White roses and baby's breath adorned every surface, their delicate fragrance mingling with the aroma of gourmet catering. Even the weather had cooperated. The afternoon's threatening clouds had dissipated, leaving a perfect summer evening. Yet Margaret felt strangely detached from it all, as if watching a movie of someone else's life. Her carefully cultivated identity as Whispering Pines' unquestioned authority was crumbling, and she wasn't sure what would replace it. "The Donovans certainly came through," Patricia commented, joining Margaret at her table. "After everything that happened, it's rather remarkable." "Yes, well," Margaret sniffed. "They had plenty of motivation to cooperate." Patricia gave her a knowing look. "I heard about the agreement you signed. Walter's calling it the HOA Constitution, checks and balances on presidential power." Margaret winced. "It was necessary under the circumstances." "It was necessary for a long time," Patricia corrected gently. "You've done wonderful things for this community, Margaret, but not everyone wants to live in a museum. Some people just want to live." Before Margaret could respond, Rob approached their table, 2 champagne flutes in hand. "Ladies," he greeted them, offering Margaret a glass, a toast to new beginnings. Margaret accepted the champagne with surprising grace. "To new beginnings," she echoed, taking a sip. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself drawn into conversations she would normally have avoided, with the Dyers about their proposed vegetable garden that she'd rejected 3 times, with the Williamses about their teenage son's band that she'd repeatedly reported for noise violations. Each interaction revealed a community she'd been policing but not participating in, neighbors who had lives and dreams that extended beyond property values and aesthetic uniformity. Near midnight, as the reception wound down, Margaret found herself alone by the pool, watching its gentle ripples in the moonlight. Rob joined her, loosening his tie. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Margaret considered deflecting, then decided against it. "I'm wondering who I am if I'm not the person keeping everything in order." Rob nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you're just Margaret. Wife, mother, neighbor. Maybe that's enough." Margaret had never considered herself capable of breaking and entering, yet here she was at 2:17 am, dressed in black yoga pants and a dark hoodie, creeping through her neighbor's side gate. The security light she'd been dreading didn't illuminate. Margaret knew this because she herself had cited the Donovans 3 times for their non-regulation outdoor lighting before they'd removed it altogether. For once, their defiance worked in her favor. The blue pool glowed faintly under the moonlight, its gelatin surface undulating slightly in the night breeze. Margaret approached it cautiously, pulling a large bottle from her tote bag. The industrial-strength drain cleaner had cost $89 at the specialty hardware store 2 towns over, where she'd paid cash and avoided the security cameras. Just a small dose, she whispered to herself. Enough to ruin the ridiculous Jello without actually damaging the pool structure. The Donovans would have to drain it, clean it, and refill it, a process that would take days. By then, Tiffany's wedding would be over, and Margaret would have found some way to explain the venue change. As she unscrewed the cap, a voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Margaret froze, nearly dropping the bottle as Rob Donovan emerged from the shadows of his patio, phone in hand. "Technically," he continued conversationally, "what you're about to do could be classified as vandalism, criminal trespass, and possibly even attempted assault, depending on how my lawyer phrases it." I was just. Margaret's mind raced for a plausible explanation. "Just about to pour chemicals into my pool in the middle of the night while dressed like a cat burglar." Rob supplied helpfully. "I've been recording since you picked the lock on my gate. Impressive skills, by the way." Margaret's legs suddenly felt weak. "You don't understand the position I'm in." "Actually, I do." Rob's voice lost some of its edge. "Your daughter's wedding is tomorrow. You promised her something you couldn't deliver, and now you're desperate." "Don't you dare judge me," Margaret hissed, though her voice trembled. "You have no idea what it's like trying to maintain standards in this community, with people like you constantly undermining authority." "People like me." Rob raised an eyebrow. "Homeowners who expect to have a say in how their property is used. People who don't understand that sometimes individual sacrifices must be made for communal harmony." Rob studied her for a long moment. "Put the bottle down, Margaret. Let's talk like neighbors." Something in his tone, not mocking, but not yielding either, made Margaret slowly lower the drain cleaner to the ground. As she straightened, the absurdity of her situation hit her fully. Here she was, a 54-year-old HOA president, breaking into a neighbor's yard in the middle of the night to sabotage a pool full of Jello. Unexpectedly, a sob escaped her throat. "I can't fail Tiffany," she whispered. "Her future in-laws already think I'm ridiculous. If the reception falls apart." Rob sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not a monster. I have kids too. But you can't just commandeer people's property." "I know," Margaret admitted, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "But I've already sent out 150 invitations. The caterers are confirmed. The decorators are coming at noon." Another sob escaped. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Rob looked at the trembling woman before him, then at the ridiculous blue Jello pool that had started it all. Finally, he glanced at his phone, still recording. "I'll make you a deal, Margaret," he said finally. "I'm willing to help you out of this situation, but there would have to be changes in how the HOA operates going forward. Real changes." Margaret looked up, hope and suspicion warring on her face. "What kind of changes?" Rob gestured toward his patio. "Let's discuss it inside. But first," he pointed to the drain cleaner bottle, "let's dispose of that properly, shall we?" As they walked toward the house, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The humbling recognition that she was at someone else's mercy. Meanwhile, Rob was already mentally calculating how quickly food-grade gelatin would dissolve in a heated pool if given the right treatment. It would be a long night for both of them.